Hello, my name is Roy Knight for Let's Study the Bible Together. Today we will be looking at Acts chapter 20, beginning in verse 1 and going down through verse 17. As always, we're going to open up our Bibles. I have mine and I hope that you have yours ready with you as well, because I want you to see the words on your own page. As you're looking and studying with your own Bible, I want you to be able to see what I am seeing as we're going through. And I want you to, as we're going through and studying this passage of Scripture, to imagine what it would be like to be Paul on his missionary journey. Whenever we begin, as we're looking at Acts chapter 20, one thing that we need to do many times is to go back. I want you to consider how we are starting this verse. This verse begins this way. After the uproar had ceased, Paul called the disciples to himself and embraced them and departed to go to Macedonia. Notice how it starts, because it says that after the uproar. Well, you have to ask the question, what uproar? Well, we have to go back to chapter 19. In chapter 19, we remember in that previous chapter here that there is an uproar due to Demetrius, who is the silversmith. And you remember that he was upset because many people were turning away from Diana of the Ephesians and beginning to accept Jesus Christ. And whenever they're accepting Jesus Christ and turning away from Diana, what is happening here is that he is losing money, and he is quite upset by this. And so he leads a mob into the Ephesian theater there and begins to shout, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." You remember from last week's study that we were looking at him and his mob, and as they are shouting out for 2 solid hours, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." And it wasn't until the city clerk had come in and quieted them down that this mob was dispersed. Now, with that in mind, we go into Acts chapter 20, and it begins after the uproar had ceased. Now, what happened after this uproar? What happened after the people went home? It said that Paul called the disciples together and embraced them and departed to Macedonia. I want us to look at this map just for a moment. I have the small circle over to the side surrounding Ephesus, kind of let us know where we are at this time. The larger circle gives us an idea of where Macedonia is and going down into Achaia. In the map, it has an arrow that is going from Ephesus over to Thessalonica. This map may be correct, but other maps have him going up through Troas and Philippi, so he may have walked it, but he may have taken a ship over. So just keep that in mind, that different maps are different. But he would be going up into Macedonia and going down to Athens. In verse 2, it goes on to say, "And whenever he had gone over that region and encouraged them with many words, he came to Greece and stayed there for 3 months. And when the Jews plotted against him as he was about to sail to Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia." And so all of these cities in which he's gone through before on his other missionary journey, Philippi and Thessalonica, Berea, going down into Athens and also Corinth, he is going back through all of those churches again, strengthening those churches. But I want us to note that at the bottom, when we're looking at verse 3 again, it says, "And when the Jews plotted against him as he was about to sail to Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia." I think that it's interesting that if they had left him alone, that he would have departed and gone to Syria, but because they harassed him, what happened is that he decided to go back through Macedonia to strengthen the churches. I want us to consider that evil should motivate us to do greater things. It should motivate us to a greater diligence. You know, whenever these Jews had risen up against him, you know, he could have said, "Well, you know, I don't want any of that. It'd be best for me just to lay it low and maybe all of this will blow over." But he didn't. He didn't. He kept on keeping on. He said, "You know what, if there's that much persecution going on, they're going to be persecuting the churches. And so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to backtrack going all the way back through, and I'm going to stop at each of these churches again, and I'm going to encourage them again. Because the persecutions that are falling upon me will certainly fall upon these Christians as well, and I want to strengthen them. And so as they are persecuting Paul during this time, it actually backfired, and now he's going back again, preaching again, and encouraging the Christians. On this map again, I want us to consider where we're at. Whenever we go to Macedonia and going south into Achaia, he again goes over to Greece, supposedly going to Athens and also Corinth as well, and now going back up to Philippi. Just to give you an idea of where we're at in our map, because a lot of towns are being named here. Not a lot of people will be named in just a little bit, but just to give us some idea. In verse 4 it says, "And Sopater of Berea accompanied him to Asia, also Aristarchus and Seleucus of the Thessalonians, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and Tychicus, and Trophimus of Asia. These men, going ahead, waited for us at Troas." Now, we have to stop right here and ask the question, who are all these people? Why are they named here? Because whenever we're talking about Paul, a lot of times we're thinking, well, it's Paul and maybe one or two other people that are going along. But who are all these people? Well, these are people that are going to accompany Paul back to Jerusalem. You remember that at this time that they are taking up funds for the Christians who are undergoing famine in Jerusalem. And Paul wanted representatives to go with him to make sure that the money would be spent correctly. I want us to look at an excerpt from Burton Kaufman's commentary from Acts chapter 20 and verse 4. He brings out something very important here. He says, "One may observe that Macedonian congregations were represented by Sopater and Aristarchus and Seleucus. The Galatian congregations were represented by Gaius of Derbe and Timothy of Lystra, and ones in Asia were represented by Tychicus and Trophimus. And it may be inferred from 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 6 and following, that the Corinthian congregation was entrusted to Titus and two other brethren sent by Paul to Corinth to receive it." And what is brought out here is that you have representatives from different churches who are accompanying Paul as he is taking this money back to Jerusalem. And again, these representatives are accompanying him just to make sure that this money is spent well, so that they can take this information back to their home congregations and to say that this is a job that has been conducted with utmost honor. When we go on, I want us to consider in this map again that we are now in Troas. Just within a few verses that we have gone from Ephesus to Macedonia to Achaia, and now we're back around again to Troas. Notice in verse 6 that it says, "And we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days joined them at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days." Now notice at the very bottom, why did he stay there for 7 days? Why would he stay there that long? I believe that the answer is found in the next verse. In verse 7 it says, "Now on the first day of the week." The first day of the week. What was so important about the first day of the week? Well, that's whenever the Christians gathered together to worship. We see that they're gathering together at this time, and Paul wanted to be there to worship with them. Notice that it goes on to say, "And whenever the disciples came together to break bread." And so the disciples gathered together on the first day of the week, on Sunday, to break bread. And the breaking of bread here is in reference to the Lord's Supper. And notice that he continues this message until midnight. He wants to be with them. He wants to worship with them. He wants to take this opportunity to teach them as much as he possibly can before he leaves. But I want us to go back and to consider that idea of breaking bread, and the purpose of gathering together was to remember the Lord and to remember His sacrifice. And you remember that Jesus was the one who instituted the Lord's Supper. as Christians, we need to ask ourselves, are we gathering together on the first day to break bread? Do you take of the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week? And when we're talking about the first day of the week, this is every first day of the week. I grew up in a denomination where we partook of the Lord's Supper once every quarter or maybe a special Sunday. But here in the Bible teaches us that Christians gather together on the first day of the week to break bread, to have the Lord's Supper. And I want you to ask yourself, within your worship, are you breaking bread on the first day of the week? And it may be, well, no, we don't. But we need to do it the Bible way, don't we? You know, the Lord's Supper is so important because this is one time out of the week where we can refocus our minds as individuals and yes, as far as a congregation of people, to remember the Lord's sacrifice. Whenever we leave worship on Sunday morning or Sunday evening and we go our different ways throughout the week, we are easily distracted. You know, we've got a lot of things on our mind. But the Lord was wise in not only instituting the Lord's Supper, but having it every Sunday, so that whenever we come back to worship, that we're always taken back to the cross. You remember that Lord's Supper is always done with unleavened bread because it was during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and it was using the fruit of the vine. That helps us to remember the body and the blood of Jesus Christ. It helps us to remember His sacrifice, and this is exactly what Paul and his fellow companions in the congregation there were remembering, the great sacrifice of Christ. I want us to go on and to consider the idea of breaking bread. The idea of breaking bread is seen in two different senses. And I want to go back to Acts chapter 2 and in verse 42 and following and look at these two different ideas that come from breaking bread. It says in verse 42, "And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, in the breaking of bread and in prayer." Now within that verse, we can understand that the breaking of bread is the Lord's Supper because everything that is done within that verse is in reference to worship. However, when we go on into verse 43, it says, "Then fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done through the apostles. Now all who believed were together, and all had things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and divided them amongst all, as anyone had need. So continuing daily with one accord in the temple, and breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart." This second idea of breaking bread is in reference to a common meal, by which Christians were gathering together within their homes to have a meal together. And so let's not get those confused. The first is speaking about the Lord's Supper, and the second one is talking about the common meal by which they would gather together. Now when we're looking back again in Acts chapter 20, the breaking of bread here is in reference to the Lord's Supper. But notice in verse 8 in Acts chapter 20 it says, "And there were many lamps in the upper room where they were gathered together." And verse 9 says, "And in a window sat a certain young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep." He was overcome by sleep. And as Paul continued speaking, he fell down from the third floor and was taken up dead. So imagine this. Paul is preaching to midnight. Perhaps many hours has gone by. There are a good number of lamps there in that upper room so that they would be able to see the Word of God, perhaps the scrolls that are there as they're gathered together, maybe even singing hymns together. And this young man is sitting in a window and he gets tired. Can you relate to that? Many times whenever we're in worship that we may get tired as the sermon goes on and on. Not that we're uninterested, but sometimes our minds may wander and we may get tired. And this young man may have been there for several hours, but in so doing, he falls out of the window, and it says that he was taken up dead. In verse 10 in chapter 20, it goes on to say, "But Paul went down, fell on him, and embraced him, said, 'Do not trouble yourself, for his life is in him.'" We go on and we look at verse 11, and it says, "And when he had come up, had broken bread and eaten, and talked a long while, even until daybreak, that he departed." Now the question rises is that, was he dead or was he alive? I think that we can imply that whenever he fell out of the window, that as it says that he was taken up dead, but as Paul comes down, he says that his life is in him. And could we be seeing a miracle here by which Paul raises him up in essence? Remember that Paul, and this is during the time of the miraculous, could have laid hands upon him as well, and he received his life back again. There's some controversy as far as that, but notice that idea that he was taken up dead or assumed to be dead, or perhaps Paul said he's assuming to be dead, but he's alive, but it could be a miracle as well. And notice that they take him up and take him back up into the room, and there again, notice what it says, "And they broke bread and had eaten." Now within this context, we're not talking about the Lord's Supper because they just had the Lord's Supper. Here, the breaking of bread is in reference to a common meal, and notice that he continued unto daybreak, that he continued all the way through the night. I find it funny that many preachers will laugh at these verses and say, "Hey, this gives me the authority to preach the midnight." Well, actually, Paul didn't preach to midnight. He preached till daybreak, whenever the sun was coming up the next morning. And that shows us how much Paul wanted to be with his Christian brethren. He knew that he would not be coming back that way anytime soon, and he wanted to spend as much time with them as possible. There would be other times in which they could sleep, but at this time he is cherishing the moments in which he has and wanted to impart unto them the wisdom of God. Whenever we look at the very bottom, it says that he talked a long while, even to daybreak, and that at daybreak was the time in which he departed. The very next verse, in verse 12, goes on to say, "And they brought the young man in alive, and they were not a little comforted." It means that they were greatly comforted that he was okay. Now, here we go on into verse 13. 13 says, "Then we went ahead to the ship and sailed to Assos, there intending to take Paul on board. For so he had given orders, intending himself to go on foot. And when he met us at Assos, we took him on board and came to Mytilene." Now, I want us to notice in verse 13 that there's a little word here, "we," and "we." That's significant because in previous verses it had talked about Paul and others, and now there's a transition within pronouns looking at we. Now, who is the we? The we here implies that Luke is with them at this time. You remember that Luke is the author of the book of Luke, but he's also the author of the book of Acts. And whenever he talks about we, he means that Luke is now accompanying Paul upon this trip. I want us to consider something perhaps that most people have not considered. Notice that they sail on to Assos. Notice again in verse 13, "And we went ahead to the ship and sailed to Assos, there intending to take Paul on board, for so he had given orders, intending himself to go on foot." Now, why would Paul say, "Okay guys, I want you to go ahead and sail to the next port, but I'm going to walk"? And there's a distance of roughly about 24 miles that's there. Why would he do that? Why would He tell them to go on, but He Himself walk? Now, if you have the answer to that, you can call me up and let me know. I don't know. Could it be that Paul is going to meet with other Christians along the way? Maybe there are other companions that with him that wanted to have some alone time with Paul, and maybe this would be an opportunity that they could walk and talk together. I don't know. But it's interesting that he tells them to sail on and he will walk and that they will meet at the next port. And so here on our map, we're looking at Assos and then Mytilene. We see that they are very close together. But this is the area, the geography where we're looking at. Now, whenever we go on into verse 15, it says, and we, meaning that Luke is included here, that we sailed from there, and the next day came opposite Chios. The following day we arrived at Samos and stayed at Trogyllium. And the next day we came to Miletus. For Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus so that he would not have to spend time in Asia, for he was hurrying to be at Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost. And so we see the ports of call in which he makes. He decides to skip Ephesus because he's already spent a lot of time in Ephesus. And I would imagine that he's thinking that if I stop in Ephesus, there's going to be a lot of people there and I will want to spend time with them and fellowship with them. And because I'm trying to get to Jerusalem, I really can't make that stop. And so he goes on to Miletus. And here on this map we have a picture of where Miletus is in relationship to Ephesus. It's not that far apart, but he goes on to Miletus. And notice in verse 17, that it says, and from Miletus he sent to Ephesus and called for the elders of the church. I think that's interesting. He didn't have time to stop in Ephesus, I'm sure because of all the Christians that were there who would want a piece of his time. But he went on a little bit further to Miletus and from there called for the elders to come to him. And in the following verses, we will see that the elders do come to him. And whenever we're looking at verses 1 through 17, it sets the groundwork for what we will see in verses 18 through the end of the chapter. This chapter is very important because as we look at 17 and following, we will look at the eldership, the qualifications that are there, and some directives in which Paul would set before them to help them to lead the congregation in Ephesus. And this next lesson is so important, and I certainly hope that you will come back and be with us at that time. But I want us to consider as we part all in which Paul had gone through Macedonia, Achaia, being harassed by the Jews and then being emboldened to continue on preaching the gospel message, going back around to Troas, to Philippi, and now down to Miletus. Paul is a diligent worker of the Lord. It is his desire in every way possible to encourage Christians, to preach the gospel message, to teach about God's kingdom and how we can be a part of it. Next time that we gather together, we will see this unfold in the lives of the elders and what they are to teach and to preach as well. I hope that the zeal in which we see in Paul will rub off on us as well. Because if Paul can do this, if Paul had that fire, then likewise we as Christians today can have that fire about us as well. There are many things in the world that would encourage us to be quiet and to distract us from our purpose. But we really need to remember what life is all about. And that is preparing ourselves for eternity and encouraging others to come along as well. I thank you so much for your time, and I certainly hope that you will be with us as we gather together again, looking at verse 17 through the end of the chapter and seeing Paul's zeal as he encourages the Ephesian elders as they continue on encouraging that congregation. Again, thank you very much for your time.